History remembers empires and emperors. It records the conquests of warriors, the strategies of generals, and the decrees of kings. Yet, there are moments when the spotlight shifts, when the script of human affairs is rewritten not by the hand of the mighty, but by someone unexpected, someone quiet, someone overlooked, someone who does not fit the mold of power, but carries authority nonetheless. In one of the most turbulent chapters in the story of ancient Israel, a woman arose, not with sword in hand, not with an army behind her, and not from a throne. She sat beneath a palm tree. She listened. She spoke what she heard, and the nation listened back. Her name was Deborah. You may have heard of David the shepherd who became king. You may know of Moses who parted the sea. But Deborah, the woman who judged a nation and led it to victory, is often forgotten. Yet she stood in a time when chaos ruled. She stood when others bowed. She heard God in a season when others heard only silence. Her story is not one of self-promotion or ambition. It is not a tale of a woman who clawed her way to the top. It is the story of a heart that was willing, a voice that was obedient, and a faith that refused to remain quiet in a dark time. When people speak of military victories in Scripture, they often recount Jericho's walls falling or Gideon's 300. But few realize that one of the most decisive triumphs in Israel's history came through the leadership of a woman. She was not a soldier, but she led warriors. She was not a politician, but she governed the people. She was not celebrated at the start, but by the end, her song echoed across generations. This introduction is not about elevating one gender over another. It is about recognizing that purpose and calling are not confined by culture. They are defined by the one who gives them. Deborah changed the course of history not because she was loud, but because she was in tune with God's voice. She stepped into a role few would dare take, and in doing so, she became a vessel for divine deliverance. Today, her name might be whispered in Bible studies or hidden in footnotes, but in her time, she was the voice of justice, the strength of wisdom, and the heart of courage. When the world around her trembled, she stood. When men hesitated, she advanced, and when God spoke, she responded. What makes her story so extraordinary is not just the battle she won, but the way she won it, with clarity, with faith, with obedience. This is the story of how one woman, without armor, without prestige, without fear, defeated an entire army. Her life reminds us that in the hands of God, even the quietest servant can become a mighty force. It reminds us that courage is not always loud, but it is always seen. And it reminds us that sometimes history turns not with a roar, but with a whisper from under a tree. Before Deborah rose to speak and lead, Israel walked through a long night, a season defined not just by foreign domination, but by internal disconnection. The people had turned their hearts away from the one who had delivered them, guided them, and called them his own. They had forgotten the covenant that once set them apart. What followed was not merely military defeat, but spiritual erosion. Under the rule of King Jabin of Canaan, the Israelites faced more than hardship. They endured humiliation, fear, and constant threat. Jabin was not a distant monarch ruling from afar. He was a tyrant who pressed down with a heavy hand. His military commander, Sisera, was a figure who inspired terror. With 900 iron chariots at his command, Sisera did not simply oversee the land, he trampled it. The roads became unsafe, villages grew silent. Trade dwindled. Families lived in the shadows, unsure whether the next day would bring violence or merely the echo of someone else's pain. But this was not just the result of superior weaponry or geopolitical misfortune. The book of Judges makes it clear. This suffering came after Israel once again did evil in the eyes of the Lord. It was not their first fall, nor would it be their last. A pattern had taken hold. When times were good, they forgot. When deliverance came, they praised for a moment, but soon wandered into the arms of foreign gods. The cycle of rebellion, oppression, repentance, and rescue marked their history like footsteps circling a desert. This particular period was especially bleak. 20 years of subjugation had worn down their resolve. The spiritual leaders were few, and the people were scattered in heart. They cried out, not simply because they were weak, but because they had reached the edge of despair. The silence from heaven was not because God had abandoned them, but because they had turned their ears elsewhere. Idolatry had not only shifted their worship, it had hardened their hearts. When a nation forgets its foundation, what follows is not just moral confusion, but the slow decay of everything that once held it together. In those days, the priesthood lacked influence. The moral compass of the people no longer pointed true north. Men and women alike went about their lives with a kind of spiritual numbness, and though they may have remembered the name of the Lord, they no longer lived by his word. Psalm 1 verse 2 speaks of the one who delights in the law of the Lord and meditates on it day and night, but Israel had ceased to meditate. The law became background noise in a land filled with the sounds of swords, wailing, and resignation. The oppression of Jabin was not just political, it was spiritual chastisement. It was the consequence of choosing to walk in darkness while claiming to belong to the light. And in that darkness, the weight grew heavier. Leaders were absent, warriors were silent, and faith became something spoken of in past tense. There was no safety in the streets. Mothers clutched their children tightly, wondering what legacy, if any, they could pass on in a land ruled by fear. Elders no longer shared stories of victory around evening fires because hope had become thin. The younger generation had grown up knowing only defeat, only hiding, only the cold stare of Sisera's chariots as they roared past like iron storms. But there was something else at work in that long season of night. The seeds of awakening often grow in silence. While many hearts gave in to despair, there were still a few who remembered, a remnant who quietly held onto the stories of old, the Red Sea, the walls of Jericho, the provision in the wilderness. Those stories had not disappeared. They waited, buried like treasure in the hearts of those who still believed deliverance was possible. Oppression, though crushing, has a way of stripping away illusions. It exposes the fragility of human strength. It reveals how quickly comfort turns to captivity when people trade obedience for convenience. In the case of Israel, it also rekindled something, a cry, not just a complaint, but a deep groaning that reached heaven. The kind of cry that can only come from those who remember what it was to be free and realize how far they have fallen. That cry was not ignored. But God did not answer with a king. He did not send another Moses or raise up a new Joshua. He did something far less predictable. Into the silence, into the pain, into the deep spiritual ache of a nation, he began to move through a woman who listened, a woman who waited, a woman who would not come with a sword, but with a word. And when she spoke, history began to turn again. In the barren stillness of a nation weighed down by fear, Deborah appears not as a warrior clothed in armor, nor as a commanding voice atop a battlefield, but beneath a palm tree. Her presence is not forceful in the way the world often measures strength. She does not rule from a throne of stone, nor is she flanked by soldiers or crowned with gold. Instead, she sits quietly available under the shade of a tree between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim. There, the people of Israel come to her, one by one, bringing their disputes, their confusions, and their longings for justice. She is called a judge, not in the modern sense of robes and courtrooms, but as a divinely appointed leader raised in a time when there was no king in Israel. Judges in those days were deliverers, raised not by election or inheritance, but by divine initiative. They were voices in the wilderness, beacons during dark seasons, reminders that God had not forgotten his people. Among them, Deborah is a singular figure. Not because she's a woman in a role typically held by men, but because her leadership arises not from personal ambition, but from deep spiritual insight and a heart that listens more than it speaks. Deborah is also called a prophetess, and this is not a mere title. It is a testimony to her relationship with the divine. She receives and relays the word of the Lord, not with theatrical flair, but with clarity, consistency, and unmistakable truth. In a time when other voices led people astray, her voice pointed them back. Her authority did not stem from charisma or heritage. It came from her intimacy with the God of Israel. The people trusted her not because she demanded loyalty, but because the wisdom she offered carried weight that could not be fabricated. Her prophetic gift was not a distant or abstract thing. It was lived out in daily interactions, in quiet discernment, and in the strength she displayed while sitting beneath that palm tree. The place where she sat was not incidental. It became a symbol of shade in the heat of injustice, of steadiness in the face of turmoil. That tree became her court, her temple, her post of service, and from there, the heart of Israel began to beat again. What makes Deborah's role even more striking is the cultural context in which she rose. Israel, like many ancient societies, was deeply patriarchal. Leadership roles were almost exclusively male. Battles were fought by men. Legal disputes were resolved by male elders. Prophetic voices were expected to belong to men trained and approved within established circles. Deborah did not check any of those boxes, and yet no one challenged her position. They did not resist her authority because it was undeniable. The Spirit of God had chosen her, and the fruit of her leadership silenced any objections. She was also referred to as a mother in Israel. This was more than a poetic phrase. It described the essence of her influence. Like a mother, she guided with wisdom, protected with discernment, and led with compassion. Her leadership was not harsh, but it was not soft either. It was firm in truth, tender in delivery, and unwavering in purpose. She carried the burdens of her people not as a queen claiming dominion, but as one who deeply cared for the soul of her nation. Her story challenges every assumption about power. She did not ascend by pushing others aside. She did not clamor for attention or authority. She simply remained faithful to what God had placed in her heart, and that faithfulness made room for influence. In a society that often ignored the voices of women, hers could not be ignored because it echoed with the weight of heaven. Deborah's strength was not in her physical stature, but in the clarity of her calling. Her authority was not a reaction to male failure, but a fulfillment of divine appointment. She was not the people's backup plan. She was God's chosen leader for that moment in history. Her life invites reflection on how God does not select based on social standing, outward appearance, or conventional roles. He looks at the heart. And in Deborah, he found a heart willing to carry a nation. Her example stands as a quiet revolution. Without shouting, without overthrowing structures, without demanding recognition, she led a people back toward righteousness. She reminded Israel not just of what justice looked like, but of what it meant to listen again, to listen to the voice of the Lord, to return to the roots of their faith, and to prepare for what was coming. Before any battle was fought, before any enemy was defeated, Deborah was already changing the course of her nation, not with a sword, but with a steady hand and an open ear. She was the unlikely deliverer, yet in God's design, she was exactly the leader Israel needed. The silence of despair had lingered over Israel for 2 decades, but God had not remained distant. In the stillness under the palm tree, Deborah received a word that would begin to shift the spiritual atmosphere of the land. The time for judgment had already been fulfilled. The time for deliverance had arrived. But as is often the case, God's plan did not unfold through thunder from the heavens or fire on the mountain. It began with a command spoken through his servant, carried on human lips, and aimed at a man who was known for his strength. Deborah summoned Barak, a warrior from the tribe of Naphtali. He was not an unknown figure in Israel. He was capable, experienced, and familiar with the terrain of conflict. Yet, when he came into Deborah's presence, it was not for military counsel or strategic alignment. He came to receive a command that did not originate with her. It came directly from God. Deborah spoke with clarity and authority, recounting exactly what the Lord had said. "Take with you 10,000 men from Naphtali and Zebulun and lead them to Mount Tabor. There, Sisera will be drawn out. God himself will give him into your hands." There was no ambiguity in the instruction. It was not a suggestion. It was a divine imperative. Barak was not being invited to consider a military campaign. He was being ordered to step into a moment preordained by heaven. The outcome had already been determined. Victory was not in question. The only unknown was whether Barak would respond with immediate obedience or allow fear to delay the fulfillment of God's promise. And in that moment, hesitation surfaced. Barak's reply was not one of bold confidence. He did not rush to gather his men or celebrate the promise of triumph. Instead, he placed a condition before his obedience. "If you go with me, I will go. But if you do not go with me, I will not go." These words were not born from arrogance, but from a deeply human place, an internal struggle between faith and fear. He respected Deborah's authority, perhaps even leaned on it too heavily, but his response revealed a heart not yet fully anchored in trust. Deborah did not rebuke him with anger. She did not belittle his weakness, but she also did not shy away from delivering the consequence of conditional faith. With unwavering composure, she responded that she would indeed go with him, yet because of the path he had chosen, because he needed assurance from her rather than resting solely on God's word, the honor of victory would not be his. The final blow, she declared, would be delivered by a woman. In ancient culture, this would have sounded almost like a humiliation, not because women lacked value, but because military glory was traditionally associated with male warriors. Yet Deborah's prophecy was not meant to shame Barak. It was meant to realign the story around God's sovereignty. The victory would not belong to the one with the strongest arm or the sharpest sword. It would belong to the one who trusted most completely. This interaction between Deborah and Barak speaks volumes about the nature of divine calling. When God says go, he does not guarantee that the path will be easy. He does not promise immediate understanding or visible signs. What he offers is his word, and in that word lies every provision, every protection, and every outcome. The test is whether the person receiving the call will step forward with courage or retreat in caution. Deborah's willingness to accompany Barak was not simply an act of support, it was a statement of shared responsibility. She was not interested in merely delivering commands from a distance. She was ready to walk into danger alongside the one she had summoned. This says much about her character, but it also reveals the cost of spiritual leadership. To speak a word from God is one thing. To stand beside those who must fulfill it is another. Faith in this moment was not about confidence in ability. It was about trust in a promise. Barak had military training, but Deborah had spiritual vision. He had weapons, but she had a word. Together, they formed a partnership not based on natural compatibility, but on divine design. Yet even in this partnership, the warning remained clear. When obedience is delayed or conditional, the path may still lead to victory, but the honor may fall on someone else. The story reminds us that when God calls, hesitation has a cost. The door to victory does not remain open forever, and the shape of a story can be altered by the response of the one called. Deborah did not force Barak's hand. She simply offered him the opportunity to obey, and when he faltered, she stood ready to continue walking in faith with or without him. Obedience to God rarely appears convenient. It often arrives at the most uncomfortable moments, asking us to step forward with little more than a promise to hold on to. But in that promise lies the power of heaven. When God says go, he does not send us alone. He sends us into battles he has already accounted for, into conflicts where the ending is known, into places where our weakness becomes the very ground upon which his strength is revealed. Barak's answer to Deborah's divine instruction was not a declaration of readiness or a bold acceptance of the call. Instead, it came with a condition, one that revealed the tension between human fear and divine assurance. He said, "If you go with me, I will go, but if you do not go with me, I will not go." These were not the words of a man who lacked military skill. They were the words of a leader who, despite his experience, needed something more than strategy or force. He needed assurance that God would truly be with him, and in Deborah, he saw the living embodiment of that assurance. Barak was not unqualified. He had been chosen for a specific reason. As a commander from Naphtali, he knew the landscape, the men, the methods of battle. Yet even with all that preparation, he hesitated. His reluctance was not born out of laziness or rebellion. It was rooted in a very human instinct, the desire to be certain before stepping into danger. He was being asked to lead 10,000 men into the hands of an army with iron chariots, an army that had oppressed his people for 20 years. From a military perspective, the odds were impossible. From a human perspective, his fear made sense. But the heart of the issue was not military imbalance. It was spiritual confidence. Barak saw Deborah not just as a prophetess or judge, but as someone deeply connected to the voice of God. Her presence gave weight to the promise. If she was willing to go, it meant that the word truly came from God. Her presence was not about strategy, it was about spiritual assurance. This moment between Deborah and Barak opens a window into how leadership can operate differently in the hands of God. Barak had strength, but Deborah had clarity. He had courage buried beneath layers of fear, but she had unwavering conviction born of divine intimacy. The condition he placed on his obedience was not simply a sign of weakness. It was a request for partnership, a desire not to walk alone into something he did not fully understand. God did not reject Barak because of his condition. The plan was not cancelled, the army was not replaced, but the prophecy shifted. Deborah told him plainly that because of his hesitation, the honor of the final victory would not be his. This was not spoken in anger. It was a matter-of-fact response that echoed a deeper truth. When spiritual leadership is undervalued or avoided, glory may be diverted, but the mission continues. God's purposes are not dependent on perfect confidence. He moves forward with the willing, even when their faith comes with conditions. Barak's story reminds us that strength and fear often coexist. Courage is not the absence of fear, it is the decision to move forward despite it. His insistence that Deborah accompany him did not disqualify him from being used by God. Instead, it revealed how God sometimes works through combinations we would never design ourselves. He pairs the hesitant with the bold, the strong with the faithful, the experienced with the spiritually attuned. Barak and Deborah were not rivals in authority, they were partners in purpose. Their collaboration was not a sign of compromise, it was a demonstration of divine strategy. In many ways, this alliance reflects how God still works. Rarely does he call people to stand alone. Instead, he forges bonds that strengthen the mission. Sometimes the one called to speak is not the one called to lead troops. Sometimes the one with the plan needs the one with the vision. And sometimes God chooses to accomplish his will through unexpected pairings, to show that no one person carries the fullness of his purpose alone. Barak's request that Deborah accompany him also speaks to the weight of spiritual authority. He did not ask her to come as a warrior or a figurehead. He asked her to come as a presence that represented divine connection. Her faith stabilized his fear. Her certainty tempered his doubt, and though she would not fight with a sword, her presence on the battlefield would shape its outcome. In this way, Barak's request was both a confession of fear and an act of faith. He recognized what she carried, and he did not want to proceed without it. This chapter in their story reminds us that God does not demand flawless bravery. He asks for willingness. He works with those who bring their fears honestly, who seek support, and who recognize that strength often lies not in solitary resolve, but in humble partnership. The moment Barak said, "If you go with me," he acknowledged his need, and in that admission God began weaving a strategy that would display not only power, but grace. Mount Tabor rose in quiet dignity, a rounded hill set against the northern landscape of ancient Israel. From its heights, one could see the surrounding plains stretching out toward the Kishon River. It was not a place one would choose for a battle based on strategic advantage alone. The enemy was better equipped, better organized, and commanded by a man whose reputation alone could paralyze resistance. Yet, it was here that Israel would face Sisera's army, and it was here that God would once again prove that victory does not belong to the strong, but to the obedient. Barak gathered his 10,000 men as instructed. They came from the tribes of Naphtali and Zebulun, not professional soldiers, but common men with a common cause. Compared to Sisera's forces, they were severely outmatched. Sisera's chariots, 900 in total, were made of iron and driven by experienced warriors trained for brutal warfare. His army had crushed resistance for 2 decades. They moved with confidence, certain of their advantage, certain of their outcome. What they did not account for was that they were not merely fighting Israel. They were stepping into a battlefield already claimed by God. As the opposing forces began to assemble, Deborah spoke again. Her words were not tactical, but prophetic. She turned to Barak and said, "This is the day the Lord has given Sisera into your hands. Has not the Lord gone ahead of you?" It was not a motivational speech. It was a divine announcement. The victory had already been settled in heaven, and now it was time for earth to catch up. Barak descended from Mount Tabor with his men, not carrying a sense of dread, but following the echo of a promise. What happened next cannot be explained by military logic. As Sisera advanced with his chariots, something shifted in the skies. A sudden storm broke out. Heavy rains poured down with such intensity that the battlefield began to flood. The Kishon River, which normally trickled along the valley, swelled with violent force. The very ground beneath Sisera's iron chariots turned to mud. Their strength became their weakness. Wheels stuck, horses panicked, movement ceased. The very instruments of terror that had ruled the land were rendered useless in the hands of nature. Nature that responded to the voice of its creator. Confusion spread through Sisera's ranks. Order dissolved. What had begun as a display of overwhelming power became chaos. Barak's men, emboldened by the signs around them, surged forward. Their weapons were simple, their numbers limited, but they moved with a momentum not their own. The fear that had once paralyzed Israel now overtook the enemy. Sisera's army collapsed under the weight of divine disruption. This was not a battle won by superior numbers or advanced tactics. It was a victory handed down by heaven. Every drop of rain, every surge of the river, every clump of mud that trapped a chariot wheel was a testimony to the fact that when God fights for his people, no force, no matter how formidable, can stand. The skies became part of the strategy. The elements bowed to the command of the Lord, who reigns above all. What made this moment even more profound was how Israel's obedience unlocked divine intervention. Barak had hesitated before, but when he stepped into the battle with faith, God moved. Deborah had spoken with clarity, and her confidence was vindicated by what unfolded. The people, though outnumbered and outarmed, walked forward in obedience, and the impossible began to unfold before their eyes. The victory at Mount Tabor is more than a story of ancient warfare. It is a revelation of how God moves on behalf of those who trust Him. He does not always use conventional means. He does not always wait for conditions to appear favorable. Sometimes He waits for someone to take the first step, and when that step is taken in faith, He unleashes power that transcends natural laws. Even today, this pattern repeats. The battles we face may not involve chariots or armies, but they are real nonetheless. Battles of fear, of uncertainty, of spiritual oppression, of circumstances that seem immovable. And like Barak and Deborah, we often stand at the edge of something daunting, unsure whether the promise we have heard can stand against the weight of what we see. But history whispers back from Mount Tabor. It reminds us that God still confounds the powerful, still breaks through barriers, and still brings victory not through might, but through His Spirit. Zechariah 4 verse 6 speaks to this truth with unwavering clarity. Not by might nor by power, but by my Spirit, says the Lord Almighty. What happened at Mount Tabor was not the result of human force. It was the manifestation of that very promise. It was the collision between human obedience and divine power, and the result was deliverance. The battle was real, the fear was tangible, the enemy was strong, but none of that was stronger than the God who had already spoken. And because His people responded, not with perfection but with willingness, He fought for them. As the storm broke Sisera's army and the battlefield dissolved into chaos, the commander himself abandoned all sense of order. Realizing the battle had turned irreversibly against him, he fled on foot, alone, stripped of the power that once made nations tremble. The great warrior, whose chariots once carved fear into the hearts of Israel, now moved in silence, away from his soldiers, away from the ruin, seeking only one thing: refuge. His armor no longer protected him. His title no longer gave him strength. He was reduced to a fugitive, running not from men, but from the God who had decreed his fall. Sisera's path led him to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite. On the surface, this seemed a place of safety. The Kenites were a neutral group, descendants of Moses' father-in-law, living in peace with both Israel and the Canaanites. The tent of a woman away from the battlefield would not arouse suspicion. Sisera assumed he had found shelter. What he did not know was that he had just stepped into the final chapter of a story already written by divine hands. Jael welcomed him with deliberate calm. She did not need to raise her voice or brandish a weapon. Her strength was not in outward aggression, but in discernment, courage, and timing. She covered him with a blanket, offered him milk instead of water, and promised to guard him from danger. In that moment, Sisera relaxed. He believed he had escaped death. He believed he had found rest. But his assumptions were rooted in the same arrogance that had led him to believe his army was invincible. What followed was an act so unexpected, so final, that it continues to echo through history. When Sisera fell into a deep sleep, Jael took a tent peg and a hammer, the tools of her domestic world, objects she handled as part of her daily life, and drove the peg through his temple. The enemy of Israel died not by sword or spear, but at the hands of a woman who was not a soldier, not a leader, not a name spoken in the courts of power. Yet in that singular moment, she became the instrument of divine justice. This was not an act of impulsive violence. It was the fulfillment of the word Deborah had spoken to Barak. Long before the battle began, Deborah had prophesied that the honor of victory would not go to Barak but to a woman. And here, in a quiet tent on the outskirts of the battlefield, that word came to pass. The final blow did not come from a general or a judge, but from a wife living on the margins of the conflict. Her courage brought closure to 20 years of oppression. Her act was not one of rage. It was one of obedience to a justice that had already been declared from heaven. The story of Jael confronts every notion about who God can use and how victory must come. She was not part of Israel's army. She did not carry a sword. Yet she discerned the moment, understood the weight of what was unfolding, and responded with clarity. Her courage was not loud, but it was absolute. She stepped into a moment that was never supposed to belong to her, and made it the turning point of a nation's freedom. Her actions may appear brutal to modern eyes, but in the context of the ancient world and the spiritual reality of Israel's deliverance, they were the final seal on a battle God had already won. Sisera's death was not merely the removal of a military threat, it was a symbol of divine intervention. The most feared man in Canaan was defeated by someone who lived outside the boundaries of conventional power. The instruments of his downfall were not forged in a blacksmith shop, but taken from the fabric of daily life. In choosing Jael, God once again demonstrated that his purposes are not limited by societal roles or human expectations. The tent peg became a sword, the hammer a weapon of justice, and in this, a message rang clear. God sees what others overlook, and he often places his most decisive plans in the hands of those who seem least likely to carry them. The finality of Sisera's death did not just mark the end of a man, it marked the end of a reign of terror. It was the conclusion to years of crying out, the response to decades of suffering, the exclamation point on a promise that deliverance would come. And it came through hands that had never trained for war, but were ready when the moment arrived. The story of Jael is not a side note. It is the turning of history through quiet faithfulness, quick action, and divine timing. Her courage fulfilled a prophecy, her presence completed a plan, and her name, like Deborah's, now stands as a reminder that in the unfolding of God's justice, no one is invisible, and no tool is too common to be used for his glory. When the last echo of battle faded and the dust settled over the plain, it was not silence that followed. It was a song. Deborah and Barak did not gather weapons or boast of tactics. They did not catalogue the number of chariots destroyed or write military records for future soldiers. Instead, they lifted their voices in praise, a song that captured the heartbeat of heaven and the history of what had just taken place. It was not merely an expression of joy, it was a proclamation of perspective. In that song, victory was not attributed to human strength or clever maneuvering. It was given entirely to the one who orchestrated every moment, the one who turned rivers into barriers and storm clouds into battle cries. The song begins not with celebration of war, but with the acknowledgement that leaders took initiative and the people willingly offered themselves. It praises the unity and obedience that arose from a scattered and fearful nation. There is an intentional connection between the movement of God and the movement of his people. Deborah sings not just of what God did, but of what happened when the people finally responded to his voice. It was their willingness to act, even when the outcome was uncertain, that opened the door for divine intervention. From the very beginning, the song repositions the entire narrative. It does not allow Israel to mistake deliverance for coincidence. It does not allow them to settle into the illusion that military effort alone changed their fate. The song makes clear that it was the Lord who marched from Seir, the God of Israel who advanced from Edom, shaking the earth, pouring rain, and moving through nature itself to fight on behalf of his people. This poetic description is more than metaphor, it is theology in motion. It teaches that when God moves, every element of creation becomes his servant. Even the skies respond. Even the ground gives way. Deborah then recounts the days leading up to the battle, painting a vivid picture of what life was like under oppression. Highways were abandoned. Villages ceased their daily rhythms. The land was filled with fear, and there was no one to lead until she arose. She does not exalt herself in this. Instead, she frames her emergence as a response to divine prompting. I, Deborah, arose, a mother in Israel, she sings, not a general, not a queen, but a nurturer of a broken nation. Her words carry humility, yet they carry also the weight of calling. She stepped into leadership not to gain power, but to restore order and faith in a disordered world. The song also names tribes and individuals, drawing attention to those who responded and those who remained passive. Some, like Zebulun and Naphtali, risked their lives on the heights of the battlefield. Others, such as Reuben, Dan, and Asher, lingered by their flocks, ships, and coastlands. This part of the song is not merely historical record, it is a moral evaluation. It honors those who acted and exposes the hesitation of those who chose safety over obedience. Worship, in this context, does not ignore responsibility. It holds up a mirror, reminding the nation that deliverance was not automatic. It came through faith, and not all were willing to step into it. When Deborah speaks of Jael, the tone sharpens. She is named most blessed of tent-dwelling women, and her act is described in vivid, almost graphic terms. The song recounts the moment of Sisera's death not with horror, but with honor. It frames her action as the final, decisive move in a divine plan that extended beyond the battlefield. The song does not glorify violence, it glorifies obedience. Jael's boldness is praised, not because of the method, but because of the courage it took to act decisively when the moment came. The most striking part of the song may be the imagery of Sisera's mother. While her son lies dead, she is portrayed as looking out the window, wondering why his chariot is delayed. Her attendants suggest he is dividing spoils, taking garments and captives. It is a chilling reminder of how deeply the Canaanites assumed victory was theirs. The song closes not with a sterile recounting of facts, but with a contrast between the assumptions of the wicked and the reality of God's justice. In that contrast, the song offers a warning. Those who oppose the purposes of God, no matter how confident they appear, will face a reckoning. Yet above all, the song is a memorial. It was not written for one day. It was crafted to be remembered, sung, and taught. It was meant to keep the story alive long after the soldiers had returned to their homes. Worship in this moment became the guardian of memory. Through melody and metaphor, the people of Israel would remember not just what happened, but who did it. They would remember that God did not forget them. They would remember that obedience brought deliverance. They would remember that He still speaks, still moves, and still raises up leaders in the most unlikely ways. The role of worship in this story cannot be overlooked. It is not the afterthought, it is the conclusion, and in that conclusion lies an ongoing invitation. Every generation that sang Deborah's song was reminded of what faith could do, of what happens when people respond to the call, and of how gratitude turns victories into testimonies. Psalm 105 verse 5 says, "Remember the wonders He has done, His miracles, and the judgments He pronounced." This song does exactly that. It does not only recount events, it seals them in the heart of a people who must never forget. In times of uncertainty, when faith begins to falter and the shadows of oppression seem to rise again, this song reminds the listener to look back, to remember, to lift their voice, not only when the battle is over, but as a declaration that the same God who delivered then is still worthy of praise today. Worship is not reserved for the end. It is a force that sustains belief, a weapon that reshapes perspective, and a song that never loses its echo. Long after the battlefield had grown silent and the song of triumph had faded into memory, the legacy of Deborah continued to speak. Her influence did not end with the victory over Sisera, nor was it confined to the years of her leadership. What she left behind was not just a historical account of courage and obedience, it was a spiritual monument to what happens when a life is surrendered to purpose without apology, without fear, and without compromise. Deborah stood in a time when women were not expected to lead, much less deliver a nation. Leadership, especially in matters of war and judgment, belonged almost exclusively to men. Yet her story did not unfold by defying those norms in anger or by forcing herself into power. It unfolded because she listened to God and responded when He called. Her life was not an act of rebellion against culture. It was an act of obedience to the one who transcends culture. And in obeying that call, she dismantled expectations without needing to declare a revolution. Her authority did not emerge from a desire to change her role. It emerged from walking faithfully in it. She led Israel without ever swinging a sword. She gave direction to generals and warriors, not because she held a military rank, but because the Spirit of God rested upon her. Her wisdom became the compass of a nation. Her presence beneath the palm tree transformed a simple spot of shade into the center of justice and truth. Her voice, anchored in prophecy and clarity, became the sounding board of a people lost in confusion. And perhaps most remarkably, she did all of this not by seeking recognition, but by living in the quiet confidence that her calling was enough. The beauty of Deborah's leadership lies in how natural it was. There was no striving to prove herself, no attempt to mimic the roles of others. She led as a woman, as a prophetess, as a mother in Israel, not trying to be someone else, but fully inhabiting the identity God had given her. This authenticity became her strength. Her influence was not derived from political maneuvering or public acclaim, but from her alignment with the heart of God. And because of that alignment, barriers broke, traditions bent, expectations shifted. She did not need a crown or a title to command respect. She earned trust through her consistency, her discernment, and her unwavering devotion to truth. Her presence gave courage to the fearful. Her leadership restored hope to the oppressed, and her example continues to whisper to every soul who wonders whether their background, gender limitations, or insecurities might disqualify them from making a difference. Deborah's life challenges the assumption that God calls only the bold, the prominent, or the traditionally qualified. She is proof that divine calling does not check societal boxes before it speaks. God does not wait for culture to give permission. He simply moves through willing hearts, regardless of who notices, regardless of whether the world understands. Her legacy is not a message about female empowerment in the way the world defines it. It is about spiritual empowerment, a call to all people, regardless of status or role, to stand firm in the assignment given by God. For Israel, Deborah's impact was transformative. She brought peace to the land for 40 years after the battle. Her leadership did not spark only military victory, it reawakened national identity. Through her, Israel remembered who they were, and more importantly, who their deliverer was. Her leadership was always pointing beyond herself. She did not desire to be the center of attention. She desired to be the voice that pointed back to the center of truth. And because she did, her influence did not fade when the battle was won. It continued to guide, to shape, and to define what faithful leadership could look like. Today, her story stands not just as history, but as invitation. It calls to those who feel unseen, to those who feel unqualified, to those who are waiting for someone to confirm what they already sense deep within, the tug of a calling that does not fit the mold. Deborah's legacy is a declaration that obedience always outranks appearance, that faith is more powerful than credentials, and that those who listen for God's voice will find that He often speaks in places others overlook. The barriers she broke were not shattered through noise or protest, but through presence. Her life was a quiet storm that moved with precision and strength, guided not by the winds of public opinion, but by the steady breath of God. And her memory remains a challenge, that we too would rise, not to make a name for ourselves, but to bear faithfully the name of the one who calls. Deborah's story is not only a relic of ancient history or a tale meant for spiritual admiration. It is a living message, one that continues to speak across generations, circumstances, and cultures. The battles may look different now, They may not involve chariots or iron swords. Instead, they come in the form of fear, discouragement, limitations imposed by others, or even the quiet resistance of our own self-doubt. But the call remains the same. Rise, listen, obey. Like Deborah, you do not have to fit the expectations of those around you to be called. You do not need to hold a position of power or have a flawless background to step into a role of influence. What qualifies you is not the approval of people, it is the prompting of God. Deborah's authority came not from public affirmation, but from divine appointment. And the same God who raised her up is still calling people today to walk forward in faith, to trust his voice above their fears, and to lead, serve, speak, or stand as he directs. There will always be reasons to stay quiet. There will always be excuses that seem legitimate. Perhaps you think someone else is better equipped, more confident, more eloquent, more acceptable to those around you. But when God speaks, he is not looking for the most polished. He is looking for the most willing. Deborah did not wait for someone to validate her before she acted. She responded to the voice that called her by name, and in doing so, she changed the trajectory of a nation. This is not a call to become someone you are not. It is a call to embrace the strength already placed within you, the gifts you carry, the insight you have been given, and the purpose that has been quietly shaping your heart all along. You may not be standing beneath a palm tree, surrounded by a crowd seeking counsel. You may be in a home that feels ordinary, in a job that feels unnoticed, or in a season that feels quiet. Yet even there, God may be preparing you for something greater than you imagined. Deborah's story tells us that obedience in stillness precedes victory in action. She listened long before she led. She waited before she moved. And when the moment came, she did not hesitate. Her faith was not loud, but it was immovable. That kind of faith, one that hears and obeys, is available to every person willing to trust God beyond their understanding. If you are facing a battle today, remember that the power does not lie in your own strength. The same God who opened the skies and flooded the rivers for Israel still moves in power when his people walk in step with his voice. Victory is not always instant. It does not always come in the way you expect. But when your heart is aligned with the one who sees the beginning and the end, you are never walking alone. You may never lead an army. You may never sing a victory song with a nation. But your faith can lead your family, restore your community, lift the fallen, and point the way forward in moments of confusion. And when you choose to respond, not because you feel ready, but because you trust the one who calls, you join the company of those like Deborah, whose lives made way for freedom and transformation. There is a Deborah within every willing heart, a voice that listens, a courage that stands, and a purpose that waits to be fulfilled. You were not created to be silent in times of struggle. You were not formed to watch from the sidelines while others shape history. You were called, equipped, and chosen to rise in faith, not for your glory, but for something far greater. If Deborah's story moved something in your heart, if you felt a stirring to rise, to trust, to believe again, then let that seed grow. Let this message live beyond this moment. Make sure to subscribe to the channel so you never miss more stories of courage, faith, and divine purpose. If this video spoke to you, like it and let others see what God can do through a single life surrendered to Him. Leave a comment below and share how Deborah's story challenged or inspired you. We want to hear your voice, your reflection, your response. And above all, share this video with someone who needs to hear that they are not forgotten, that they are called, and that their obedience still matters. Let Deborah's legacy be more than memory. Let it become movement, your moment, your mission. It begins now.